I've lived in this suburban neighborhood for nearly 2 decades now, and during that time, I've witnessed just about every quirk and oddity from our homeowners association. In my younger days, I never imagined that one day a bunch of petty rule sticklers could turn into what I've come to call the HOA cops. But over the last few years, they've developed an unnerving pattern. Uniform-like attire, HOA-branded vehicles, and what I can only describe as a quasi-police force. I thought I'd seen it all. Then they brought in the K9 unit. Yes, an actual dog unit, to investigate my driveway closure. Let me start from the beginning. This neighborhood, sleepy as it may seem, has its share of bizarre drama. We have a small population of retirees, empty nesters, and a sprinkling of younger couples. In theory, it's a lovely slice of suburbia. Manicured lawns, wide sidewalks, and a central clubhouse meant for resident gatherings. That clubhouse, ironically, is where most of our enforcement issues stem from. The volunteer HOA board meets there weekly, although they call it public meetings, which is a laugh. It's about as public as an underground bunker, and good luck voicing your opinions if you're not on the board. I've been dealing with a particularly nosy board member named Dolores. She's an older lady with a penchant for crocheted sweaters, always with a small notebook tucked in her cardigan pocket. She scribbles incessantly whenever she sees me mow my lawn an inch too low or paint my mailbox something she deems inappropriate. I swear, if I put my trash can out a minute before 6 p.m., she'd log it into that notepad. Over the years, I've tried to keep the peace. I paid every fine, followed every bizarre rule, and tried not to rock the boat too much. But about 3 months ago, I decided to replace my old, cracked driveway with a new design. It wasn't anything too fancy, just a slightly wider driveway with a path on the side leading to my front door. I had the proper permits from the city, which is all that's really required by law. Yet, the HOA insisted that I must also get a special architectural approval from them. The problem is they kept postponing my request, giving me more red tape than I ever imagined could exist for something as simple as concrete. I thought, maybe I'll go ahead and do it anyway. They can't block me forever. So, I arranged my contractors, poured the new driveway, and kept it blocked off with safety cones and tape so no one would mistakenly drive on it before it fully cured. Fairly standard procedure, right? Not to the HOA. The very next morning, I came out to find half of my cones gone and a note scrawled in angry capital letters taped to my front door. You are in violation of the CCRS. Remove blockade immediately. I felt a flicker of anger. I had city permits. I'm allowed to close off my driveway for a few days to let the concrete set. My cars could stay on the street temporarily. It's not like I was inconveniencing anyone. But the HOA apparently considered my brand new driveway unauthorized, and as an act of defiance, I replaced the cones, taped them down, and added a big sign that read, "Do not enter. Driveway closed for construction." Within hours, Dolores appeared, flanked by 2 other board members. They strutted down the sidewalk like a group of hall monitors on a mission. I stood on my front lawn, trying to keep calm. Dolores clicked her pen and said, "Sir, you are in direct violation. We require you to open your driveway for community access." Community access? That was a new one. I asked, is the HOA planning on having a barbecue in my driveway? Who else but me needs to drive on my property? She gave me one of those disapproving frowns, the kind you might imagine someone wearing if they found gum in their hair. She informed me that, per the HOA's rule book, no driveway may be restricted from general use without the express written permission of the board. I try to reason with them. Look, the fresh concrete needs to cure. It's my property. I have the city permits. This is standard practice. But logic rarely sways people who are set on flexing their authority. They told me I would be fined $50 a day for every day the driveway remained blocked. I told them I'd speak with my lawyer if they insisted, as city ordinances trump HOA rules. That threat didn't scare them in the slightest. They just reminded me that the HOA had other measures if I refused to comply. Now, I had no idea how far they'd go. The following day, I was inside when I heard vehicles outside. Thinking it was the contractors returning, I peered through the curtains. Instead, I saw 2 black SUVs with HOA enforcement emblazoned on the side doors. People in navy blue jackets were piling out. It looked absolutely ridiculous, like a bootleg police force. My driveway was roped off, so they took positions on the sidewalk, snapping pictures, scribbling on clipboards, barking orders at each other. It was bizarre. I decided to go about my day and not indulge this nonsense. But when I noticed a second wave arriving and heard barking, yes, an actual dog barking, I realized this was about to get stranger than I ever could have anticipated. When I saw the dog, my first thought was that maybe someone needed a service animal, or they were doing some demonstration. But no, this was an official K9. At least that's what the large lettering on the dog's harness read. HOA K9. I nearly burst out laughing. There was a German Shepherd jumping out of the second SUV, followed by a stern-looking man in a matching blue jacket. I felt like I was in a comedy sketch. Despite the absurdity, I actually started to get a bit nervous. A well-trained K9 could be intimidating, and I didn't want to spook the poor animal or get on the wrong side of its handler. I also felt outraged. Who in their right mind authorizes an HOA to have a K9 unit? Last I checked, you needed special training, licensing, and a legitimate police department behind you to conduct that kind of operation. But here they were, marching onto my property like it was some grand sting operation. I stepped outside, arms raised in confusion. Could someone please tell me what's going on? Are you accusing me of dealing contraband from my driveway? My voice echoed in the crisp morning air. The dog let out a warning bark. The handler pulled him back, telling the dog to heel. That's when a tall man with a trimmed, gray beard stepped forward. I'd never seen him before, but his name tag read Chief Enforcement Officer. Underneath, smaller text read HOA Department. He told me in a clipped tone, "Sir, we received reports of illegal activity here." I blinked. Illegal activity? From me? You must be joking. He gave a curt nod. We have reason to believe you're obstructing community property for private gain. I took a long breath, trying not to lose my temper. This so-called chief enforcement officer was talking like a real police officer, but I suspected he had zero legal authority. First of all, it's my driveway. Second, I have city permits. Third, this is absolutely ridiculous. My neighbor, Jerry, an elderly Vietnam veteran, came hobbling down the sidewalk, scowling. What in tarnation is going on here? Jerry liked to keep to himself, but apparently the commotion had rattled him enough to come investigate. The chief turned to him and repeated the same line about receiving reports of illegal activity. Jerry folded his arms. I've lived next to this man for years, and I've never seen him break the law. Not even a noise violation. While Jerry and the chief continued their tense exchange, I noticed Dolores creeping around near the new concrete. She was acting as if she was collecting evidence, snapping pictures on her phone, and then scribbling in that little notebook of hers. I wondered if she was about to start measuring the temperature of the concrete or count the pebbles in the aggregate. The entire spectacle was beyond comprehension. Suddenly, one of the board members in a navy blue jacket strode over to me, brandishing a form. You have 15 minutes to remove your barrier from the driveway, or the HOA enforcement will do it for you. I stared at the form. It was a piece of paper with the HOA letterhead, warning me that if I didn't comply, they would impound my personal property, meaning the cones and caution tape, and potentially escort me off the premises. Essentially, they were threatening to forcibly remove me from my own home in my own neighborhood. It was ludicrous. Still, I remember reading a cautionary tale from a different homeowner online. Someone who got into a legal battle with their HOA over something small and ended up bankrupt from endless lawsuits. As outraged as I was, a part of me was reluctant to start a prolonged legal war that might cost me dearly. But I also had my pride. I looked them square in the eye and said, I have every right to keep my driveway closed for these next few days. This is my property, my investment, and it's still curing. Your own rules don't override city code. I could practically hear them bristle. The chief turned away from Jerry and stepped up to me. We have a K9 unit on standby, he said, gesturing to the dog as if that would scare me into submission. We can and will search the property if we have any suspicion of wrongdoing. Are we clear? Now, I'm not usually a confrontational man, but being threatened by some wannabe officer and his dog really got under my skin. What exactly do you think you'll find on my driveway? Wet cement? You'll need to issue a warrant for that. The dog's handler stiffened. We follow the HOA's code of conduct. We don't need a warrant for a community property violation. Community property violation? That phrase again. They seem to believe that my driveway was somehow partly theirs. Talk about an overreach. Jerry piped up, "Don't you folks have anything better to do?" That was the moment when things escalated from threatening to downright menacing. The chief stepped back and gave a curt nod to the handler. The dog started barking again, pulling at its leash. I was hit with a flash of fear. I love animals, but I didn't want to be on the receiving end of an attack dog. Then, the chief bellowed, "Remove the cones." Now, I folded my arms, my heart racing, but my frustration boiling over. Make me. In hindsight, maybe that wasn't the wisest thing to say, but I'd been pushed to the brink. Enough was enough. The tense standoff made for quite a spectacle. By now, half a dozen neighbors had gathered across the street or peeked from behind their curtains. A few younger ones held up their phones, filming this surreal HOA drama as if it were some shocking reality TV. From the corner of my eye, I could see Dolores whispering into her phone, possibly calling more reinforcements or, for all I knew, the actual police. The German shepherd barked again, and the handler tried to hush him. The dog's eyes were fixed on me, but the bark didn't seem aggressive. It was more like the dog was mirroring the tension all around. My stomach churned with adrenaline. I considered my options: comply with these overzealous folks or stand my ground. Finally, I turned to Jerry, who seemed just as disturbed. "Jerry," I said loud enough for everyone to hear, "would you mind getting your camera ready? I wanted documentation of whatever happened next, especially if it involved them forcibly removing property or making false allegations." Jerry nodded and pulled out his old digital camera. He wasn't exactly tech-savvy, but he would try his best. "Sir, you have 10 minutes left," the chief warned. He was glaring at me like I was some sort of hardened criminal. I took a breath and calmly, but clearly responded, "Until what? You let the dog loose on me? That's illegal. And you know it?" A flicker of doubt crossed the chief's face. I suspected that he, too, realized how ridiculous it would look for an HOA to deploy a K9 on a resident over a driveway dispute. Yet he held his posture. "We can and will enforce the community standards. Last chance to remove your blockade." Before I could retort, Dolores stepped forward. "We have reason to believe you're deliberately causing distress to your neighbors." She pointed an accusatory finger at the cones. "This is a public safety hazard. Emergency vehicles can't get through. Delivery trucks can't get through." I almost laughed. I'm on a quiet cul-de-sac. There's plenty of street parking, and my driveway isn't blocking the road at all. This is nonsense, and you know it. But Dolores wasn't done. "We have a statement from a neighbor complaining you blocked access to their property." That was absurd. My driveway isn't shared. The only person who could complain is my next-door neighbor, but Jerry was standing right there supporting me. "Who complained?" I demanded. Dolores gave a smug smile and waved her phone. "That information is confidential, but it's been reported." I suspected the complaint was fabricated. Perhaps she typed it up herself. Regardless, the intimidation tactics were in full swing. The chief signaled to the dog handler, who stepped forward with the K9, so close now I could feel the dog's breath. My anger and fear were at a boiling point. Why on earth were they stooping to this? Was it about a power trip? Money? Or maybe it was just personal vendettas from Dolores, who despised anyone defying the rules. Then, from out of nowhere, an actual police cruiser, a real one, rolled onto our street. My heart skipped a beat. Were they responding to the scene? Or had someone called them about the fiasco? Either way, I felt a sense of relief and dread. If the official police were here, maybe this could be de-escalated. Or it might get worse, depending on how the HOA spun their story. A uniformed officer stepped out of the cruiser. He looked around, taking in the bizarre scene of multiple HOA members in matching jackets, an official-looking dog, and me standing by my cones. The neighbors were murmuring and filming. The officer approached with a professional calm, while the chief and Dolores quickly strode up to intercept him. I caught snippets of their conversation. "He's violating community codes, refusal to comply. We have K9 on the scene." The actual officer's expression went from curious to baffled. He walked over to me, apparently wanting my side of the story. I gave him the short version. The driveway was newly poured, the city permits were in order, and the HOA was threatening me with fines and forcibly removing my cones. I handed over the permits I kept in a folder just in case. The officer glanced at them, then raised an eyebrow at the small crowd of HOA enforcement. He called the chief over, clearly wondering what the real police had to do with an internal HOA matter. Dolores started chirping in again, repeating that I was obstructing community property and endangering neighbors. The officer asked a straightforward question. Is this a shared driveway or a private driveway? Dolores stuttered. Well, this entire neighborhood is under our association guidelines. The officer gave a pointed look. Sure, but the driveway belongs to him, correct? She tried to dance around the question, so the officer turned to me again. Can I see evidence you own this property? I produced my mortgage statement, which was in the same folder as the permits. The officer nodded politely and turned back to Dolores. Ma'am, this looks like private property to me. He's not blocking the street or interfering with any main thoroughfare. If he has a permit, he's within his rights. Dolores bristled, color rising to her cheeks. The chief stepped in, but our homeowner guidelines clearly state. The officer cut him off. Homeowner guidelines can't supersede city law. This man has a valid permit. Unless there's a credible claim of criminal activity, you can't forcibly remove his cones or deploy a dog on him. At that, the dog handler looked sheepish. He tried to hide behind the German Shepherd, who seemed more bewildered than anything. The real officer let out a sigh. Look, I know you're trying to maintain some standards here, but brandishing a K9 and threatening to remove property is more than an overreach. If you do anything to harm or threaten this resident, that's a criminal matter. Now the older neighbors across the street began clapping. Jerry gave a little fist pump, and I felt relief washing over me. Dolores and the chief exchanged dark glances. They'd been publicly admonished by a real cop in front of half the neighborhood. But the tension didn't evaporate. Instead, the chief's jaw was set in anger. He was clearly not going to let this go. We reserve the right to pursue civil penalties, he spat. The officer shrugged. That's between you and him in civil court. But keep the dog out of it. Understand? Dolores nodded stiffly, but the look in her eyes told me this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. With the police officer's stern warning hanging in the air, the HOA's self-styled enforcement team began packing up. They corralled the German Shepherd back into the SUV. The handler avoided making eye contact with anyone, likely embarrassed by the entire fiasco. Several neighbors drifted away, though many lingered, clearly wanting to see what would happen next. Dolores lingered too, standing by the curb while the chief enforcement officer took off in his black SUV. She was tapping on her phone with an expression that mixed anger and bitter determination. I half expected her to whip out a new pad of citations. Instead, she stared at me from across the street, then marched over. I squared my shoulders, bracing for more confrontation. Jerry gave me a supportive pat on the back before heading inside, possibly to rest. I hoped he'd email me the photos and videos so I could share them if necessary. Dolores approached. You may have gotten a free pass today, but the board will convene and you will be fined heavily for your defiance. Expect an official notice within the week. Dolores, I replied calmly, this entire stunt was outrageous. A K9? That's not what the HOA is for. It's one thing to send a letter or talk things over, but this was harassment. She glared at me with barely concealed loathing. You've always been a problem, flaunting the rules, painting your shutters a color we never approved. I held up a hand. Those shutters were painted the same hue they were originally. And I gave you notice. I'm done arguing with you. You heard the cop. I have every right to close my driveway until the concrete cures. If you want to take me to civil court, feel free. I'll see you there with my lawyer and all the footage from today. For a moment, she seemed at a loss for words. Then she snarled, we'll see about that, and stalked off. I watched her go, feeling both exhausted and oddly triumphant. Part of me was worried about the financial threats. HOAs can pile on fines, and some can even foreclose on properties for unpaid penalties. I wasn't eager to face that, but I also felt I needed to stand up for myself. Letting them trample on my rights would only embolden them further. Over the next few days, life settled back into its routine, except for the fact that I periodically found new notes taped to my front door. Cease driveway closure immediately, they read, or last warning. Pay your fine. Each one was signed by some official-sounding HOA title. I ignored them. My driveway needed time to fully harden, and once it was safe, I removed the cones. Simple as that. But the real showdown came 2 weeks later. I received a certified letter from the HOA. It stated that I was being fined $50 for each day the driveway was blocked, which they calculated at 10 days, plus an additional $250 for obstructing an official investigation. The total came to $750. The letter demanded immediate payment, threatening legal action if I refused. Now, $750 isn't pocket change, but it also wasn't going to break me. However, the principle of the matter riled me up. They had no legitimate reason to fine me. The letter included a line stating, "Your unauthorized closure of community-adjacent property violates Clause 16B of the HOA covenant." That was their entire basis for claiming the driveway was community-adjacent. Not exactly a strong legal argument. I decided to consult a lawyer, a local attorney named Marjorie, who specialized in real estate and HOA disputes. She was an older woman, sharp as a tack, and very knowledgeable about local statutes. I explained the entire situation, from the K-9 standoff to the daily fines. She listened patiently, took notes, and asked a few questions. Then she leaned forward, tapping her pen on her desk. "You have the advantage here. HOAs can enforce certain guidelines, but they can't override city or state codes. They also can't declare private property community property just because it's near the street. This fine is unenforceable unless they take you to court." She grinned. "And if they do, we'll countersue for harassment and emotional distress. You have plenty of evidence to back that up." Relief washed over me. "So, should I ignore them?" I asked. She cautioned me. "You may want to respond in writing, politely but firmly. Let them know you won't be paying because their fine has no legal basis. That might deter them from escalating. If they do push it, we'll be ready." That same day, with Marjorie's help, I drafted a letter to the HOA. I reaffirmed that I have all necessary city permits. I noted the official police response, which indicated no wrongdoing on my part. I stated that if they persisted in attempting to collect an invalid fine, I would consider it harassment. I mailed it via certified mail, ensuring they couldn't claim they never received it. A week passed, and I heard nothing. Then, one evening, I noticed a car parked outside my house for an unusually long time. It was the same black SUV with the HOA enforcement decal. Sitting inside was the dog handler, though I didn't see the German Shepherd. He seemed to be watching my house, perhaps hoping to catch me in another alleged violation. When I went out to check my mailbox, he quickly drove away. 2 days later, I got a second letter. This one was from an HOA law firm, a place I'd never heard of. They threatened that if I didn't pay the $750, they would place a lien on my house. Now I was furious. A lien is serious business. I called Marjorie immediately, and she reassured me that they couldn't place a valid lien without a court order and a proper basis. Nonetheless, the threat was enough to cause me stress. We decided it was time to send a stronger warning. Marjorie composed a thorough cease and desist letter, threatening legal action against the HOA if they persisted with baseless fines, intimidation tactics, or attempts to place an illegal lien. She also demanded they provide copies of any complaints filed about me. Legally, they're required to disclose the substance of those complaints if they're being used as a basis for fines. Finally, we included the video links and photos Jerry had taken, evidence of the K-9 intimidation and the real police officer telling them to back off. We made it crystal clear that if this went to court, we would seek damages, attorney fees, and public exposure of their outrageous behavior. We mailed everything off and braced for battle. Yet, perhaps surprisingly, the next 2 weeks were utterly quiet. No more letters, no more random black SUVs, no more notes taped to my door. At the monthly HOA meeting, which I attended just for kicks, Dolores was nowhere in sight. The new agenda had a vague mention of adjusted enforcement policies, but no direct references to me or any fines. Out of curiosity, I inquired about Dolores. One of the board members whispered that she took a leave of absence. Whether she was forced out or left on her own was anyone's guess. As for the chief enforcement officer, I never saw that man in the neighborhood again. I asked around, and apparently his contract was not renewed. The K-9 vanished just as quickly, presumably because the HOA realized how ridiculous it was to maintain a dog unit they had no right to use in the first place. Despite the stress and aggravation, I consider it a victory. My driveway is in perfect condition, my cones are gone, and life is back to normal. I never paid a dime of that $750 fine, nor did they ever again mention placing a lien. Marjorie's last update was that she heard the law firm quietly dropped the case after seeing our cease and desist. Now, every so often I'll see a new family moving in or a neighbor making home improvements, and I shudder at the thought of them dealing with this kind of harassment. But maybe this incident served as a wake-up call for the HOA. If they try to bully residents in the future, they'll have a huge fiasco on their hands, and possibly a real lawsuit. So that's the saga of my run-in with the so-called HOA cops. They actually brought a K-9 unit to enforce a phony driveway closure violation. It was surreal, stressful, and at times downright comical. But in the end, I stood up for my rights, and hopefully, I prevented the HOA from pulling this nonsense on someone else. My only regret is that the German Shepherd never had a chance to just be a normal dog. From what I saw, he seemed perfectly friendly, just caught up in the madness orchestrated by people with an inflated sense of authority. But hey, at least the story ends with me enjoying my new driveway in peace. And if Dolores ever resurfaces, I'll be ready to remind her, politely and firmly, that my private property is indeed mine, and no cursory HOA rules can change that.